Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is an absolutely gorgeous Wednesday. Today is the 16th day of December. It's kind of hard to believe because the temperatures out there are still warmer than they ought to be. And to be honest with you, warm enough at this time of the year. I don't think we wanted any warmer than it is. It is absolutely fantastic. I trust that the weather is good where you are. If you're in the eastern part of the country, then I know that's true. If you're in the western part of the country, then I'm aware that it's not. And what you're having is what we're going to get. So I'm aware of that. But on the other hand, I want to be grateful for what we get. And the fact of the matter is we've had 2 months that last year were terrible months. We've had 2 months that have so far been absolutely stupendous. And knowing that we're going to pay for it after the first of the year. But right now, things are still good, and I think everybody's kind of happy about it. It is a pleasure to be with you today on this Wednesday, the 16th day of December. I do want to apologize for the fact that we were not able to do a live program here at the Virtual Center yesterday. I was prepared to do one, and very honestly got kind of something came up, and it was something that I didn't feel comfortable getting out of. So I called Bob Kincaid a couple of hours before airtime and asked if he could put in some sort of a substitute program for yesterday, because I didn't feel that this was something that I could pass up on. And we did that, and I missed the program because I was kind of ready for it. Today I'm planning to address some of the things that I was hoping to do yesterday. Actually, I believe that I've got a little bit more information than I had yesterday. So I'm hoping that the extra day will produce positive results. At least I hope so. We would love to hear from you. I want to begin today's program by doing a little bit of wrap-up or review on the administrative state issue that we dealt with in Monday's program here at the Virtual Center. And I wanted to touch base and wrap up a few things. And if you have comments or suggestions or questions, criticisms, whatever they might be, we would love to hear from you on them. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to share your thoughts with me one-on-one in an email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And also, I do want to make you aware of our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page, and there's quite a bit on there. There's several substantive pieces, I believe, that if you have questions or comments on those, by all means, feel free to email me or to communicate with me via Facebook, or indeed give us a call at our phone number, 304-663-4676, because we would love to hear from you. Most of the issues that are addressed on the Facebook page are issues that we have dealt with here at the Virtual Center. So your comments would be quite appropriate, quite timely, and welcomed. I probably should open by making a comment. I put a little tidbit on Facebook this morning because I felt the responsibility of responding to last night's Republican debate in one way or another. I watched the follies, and it seemed like everybody was in attack mode last night, and all the results and the post-debate focus groups and all the rest of it have been on, and I know CNN was still doing panel discussions this morning on who won and who lost and who helped themselves and who didn't, and various things. And it obviously depending on where you are politically, you had quite a choice because you had 13 people debating, 9 of them on the major debate, and 4 of them on the early debate. There's absolutely no question that Lindsey Graham won the early debate. All the polls and all the pundits basically say that. There was one particular thing that Lindsey Graham said, and it was excuse me, I'm sorry about that. It was in a kind of a response to Donald Trump, and it was about Trump's recommendation that we ban all Muslims from the country until we, as he said, until we learn what's going on. I don't quite know what that means, but anyway, Lindsey Graham's point was that we have 3,500 Muslim Americans serving in our military, and we're telling people around the world that they need to join us and we need to get together and we need to unite against ISIS and all that. And then you turn around and tell these same people that they're not welcome here in the United States. And he talked about how un-American and how counterproductive this was. And it was kind of about one of the few things in the entire evening that I thought was a positive. Other things came out of Lindsey Graham's mouth that I wasn't quite as positive about, but I did think that was particularly appropriate. My little comment on Facebook this morning mentioned Scott Walker and Bobby Jindal, and basically my comment was everybody on the stage last night seemed to be in attack mode. I really hated that Scott Walker and Bobby Jindal missed the opportunity to be attacked, I guess is what I was saying. But anyway, the one thing that I will make a comment, because I do think it's pretty relevant. As many of us know, the debate took place at the Venetian in Las Vegas. And many of us also know that the Venetian is owned by Sheldon Adelson, who's a big backer of Republican candidates for president. And we know, for example, that last year, there's no question that he kept Newt Gingrich in the race well beyond the point at which Newt Gingrich still should have been a viable candidate in the previous election. So the point is that Adelson has quite a bit of say in terms of what the Republican Party stands for and what the candidates that it nominates are about. We also know from past experience that Adelson's pet project, if you will, or the thing that he cares most about is Israel. And many of you will remember that different candidates were summoned to Las Vegas previously to have an audience with Adelson, and there's absolutely no question that what he was particularly interested in was each candidate's position on Israel. And one of the things that occurred previously was that I believe it was Chris Christie made a comment and made reference to Israel, to the West Bank as occupied territory, and apparently that didn't go over well with Edelman, and it was necessary to have an after the debate meeting and to apologize and to get back in the good graces of Edelman. Now we're hearing more and more about Edelman's wife, Miriam, because it appears that while he was ready to support a particular Republican candidate, the word right now is that particular candidate he favors is probably Rubio. Miriam, it seems, is much more inclined toward Ted Cruz. So the question is, will they be able to come together and parlay their money behind one candidate, or will they end up supporting two different candidates within the same household, whatever. But anyway, the point was that I fully expected, since last night's debate was at the Venetian, I fully expected that the issue of Israel and support for Israel would come up. Because I do know, and I think many of us read reports which indicated that a number of the candidates met with Adelson all day yesterday prior to last night's debate. And one of them, of course, the one that got the attention was Donald Trump. And Trump made very clear before the meeting took place that he didn't want Adelson's money, although he did solicit his support. And he did have a pre-debate meeting with Sheldon Adelson. So I actually assumed that the issue of Israel would come up. I thought maybe one of the questions might deal with the fact that Sheldon Adelson is so adamant in about the nation's position, the party's position in dealings with Israel and with Netanyahu. And so I kind of thought that there might be a question that would direct the entire debate's attention to the link between Israeli policy and Sheldon Adelson. So the debates and the back and forth, I was kind of surprised that the question of Israel didn't seem to come up at all. So I found that particularly revealing. I don't know if there's meaning to it, and if there is, I'm not sure what it is at this point. But I thought it was worth mentioning, and I posted that on the Facebook page earlier today. Before we get too far into our program today, I would like to go back and touch upon a couple of the points that we made in Monday's program about the conservative attack, if you will, on the administrative state. And I'm not going to go back through all the review of the Charles Cooper article and George Will's recreation of the Cooper article, and both of them supporting the positions being taken in recent concurring opinions by Justice Clarence Thomas, except to say that there are a couple of important things that it seemed to me we did touch on Monday. I will also say that at the beginning of the program on Monday, I made mention of the fact that a good friend of mine had been suspended from his job for alleged insubordination because of the publication of an article in the state's journal, in the Charleston Gazette, the state's educational statewide newspaper. And I was a little bit concerned. I found out about that just prior to the beginning of the program on Monday. At the end of the program, when we finished on Monday, I didn't feel that I did justice to the material that I wished I had done. I really do believe that the administrative state issue is an important one, and I think the attack on it is significant as well. I hope that I was able to make the points clear that I wanted to make, because I do believe that this is a very, very important, a very serious issue. Let me touch on two or three of the concluding points that I kind of wanted to revisit, if for no other reason than just to highlight them again and emphasize them and ask that you think about them and consider them. And if you do have a reaction or a question or a comment, I would love to hear from it. Please feel free to call in or to write me an email or whatever. It seemed to me that one of the significant things that came out of our program on Monday is something that I remember mentioning, but at the same time, I don't think it was emphasized nearly as much as it ought to have been. And that is going back to the 18th century and the basic attitude towards government's priority function. And one of the things we talked about on Monday is that if we look at the Federalist Papers, most specifically at Federalist number 10, Federalist number 51, a few of Hamilton's papers, and whatever, it's very clear that the checks and balances, separation of powers system built into the Constitution as it was originally written were designed to make government's ability to govern difficult. By separating powers and by giving each branch of government an element of control over the other branches, then what you do is make it much more difficult to move legislation through that system. There are so many levels on which a particular piece of legislation could be stopped, could be halted. It needs to pass both houses of Congress. It needs to pass both houses of Congress in exactly the same form. And we know that if different forms of the same general idea for a particular piece of legislation pass the two houses of Congress, then it's necessary that they have some sort of a meeting of the minds, that they get together and come up with a version of the legislation that they can both sign off on. Then it goes to the president. And of course, the president has the opportunity to veto it, and has some control over the legislature in the veto power. On the other hand, we know that the way the checks and balances system works is that the legislature, in turn, has control over the president to a degree, because the legislative branch of government, especially the House of Representatives, controls the budget, controls the purse strings. And so therefore, by denying the president funding, Congress has the ability to make it difficult for the president to implement particular policies and programs that Congress does not like. And then finally, there's the Supreme Court, which through the idea of the power of judicial review is given the authority and the responsibility for determining the constitutionality of particular pieces of legislation. And we know from previous recent court decisions how rocky that process can be. So the point is that it's very, very difficult to move ideas or policy through the mechanism in order to bring it into being, to basically bring law into reality. It's a process that takes time. It's a process that initiates discussion and theoretically would benefit from compromise and open discussion and deliberation and all the rest of it. The result is that Congress can't function, or the government can't function that rapidly. It's not easy to run something through this system and get it through from beginning to end that easily. This is obviously by design. There's absolutely no question then that the separation of powers and checks and balances system was intended, as Madison said, to control the violence of faction. But the real world applications of separation of powers and checks and balances is to slow down the process, to incorporate or encourage greater deliberation and conversation about what is moving through the system. The idea being that when government does act and comes to a final conclusion, it'll be more likely that the proposals or the policy being approved has gone through the mechanism, has gone through the hoops necessary, and therefore if anything was particularly wrong with it, it would have shown up during this process. In other words, it just slows down the process, the thinking being to improve it. So in reality then, one could say, which is what I said on Monday, one could say that the Constitution of the United States, the way it was written, the way it was organized or structured, was more focused on controlling legislation in order to prevent bad legislation from making it through the system than it was in responding to the real needs of the people of the United States. In other words, one could almost say, and I did say, that there was really more focus on government not being able to govern than to govern. The idea or the sense of the 18th century was that the more difficult it is for government to govern, the less government there is, the less visibility there is, the better off for the citizens. The assumption being, of course, that individual freedom and an aggressive, active government are in contradiction to each other. The more government there is and the more government visibility and control there is, the less individual freedom there is, and vice versa. So therefore, I've always concluded that in 18th century thinking, the idea that government actually could become aggressive and active and visible and responsible, that government would actually look for and seek opportunities to respond to real citizens' needs and wants, was considered to be a very dangerous thing, and that in part, that's why the separation of powers, checks and balances system, in part at least, was even there. I think that's a very, very significant point to focus on for at least a moment. And as we leave this issue of the administrative state and the attacks on the administrative state, I think it's very important to recognize that particular issue, that particular point. By definition, the administrative state, as defended by and explained by and rationalized by Woodrow Wilson in his 1887 article entitled The Study of Administration, the operative assumption that drives Wilson's entire argument is that government needs to govern, that the people need a visible, active, responsible government, and that government must have the power and must have the flexibility to respond to real needs and real challenges and crises that occur in our society. The point that I'm making here is that there's a basic contradiction between the idea of the administrative state and the philosophy of government which the Constitution created in 1887, 1888. In other words, the thinking of the nation had changed in the 100 years that the Constitution was in effect prior to the time that Woodrow Wilson wrote his piece. And the principal change that we associated with progressivism or the progressive movement was the idea that the public interest required government intervention. The principal issues of the late 19th and early 20th century focused around the belief or the concern that too many Americans were being cast aside, were being buried by the inordinate power and wealth and visibility of corporations. That corporations had so much unchecked power and flexibility and influence in American society that too many people were on the losing end of the whole situation. Working people were organizing unions and desperately trying to find a way to counter the power of corporations. But we also know that in the late 19th century, conservatives controlled the Supreme Court of the United States. And the result was that the interpretation of statute law, the interpretation of the Constitution in the late 19th century, put working people in a very, very negative position. And it seemed like unions, working people, farmers, were being cut off at the pass no matter what they tried to do. And therefore, it seemed like the only alternative left for working people in this country was to turn to government, with the idea that government could respond to what they believed were real, serious, unmet needs and wants and concerns. The idea was that corporations were becoming so big, so powerful, so wealthy, and so influential in American society that they were literally destroying the whole idea of the American dream as even being possible. Freedom, the idea of individual freedom, while it sounded good in theory, to too many people was meaningless in real life, because freedom got them nowhere. Their jobs were vulnerable. Their living standards and the way that they lived their lives were inadequate. They were susceptible to disease and fraud and usury and all of these other things, and they seemed to have no protection because corporations were relatively unaccountable to anybody. And the Supreme Court was reinforcing that view by basing its interpretations of law on the 18th century view of the legitimate role for government. In other words, by going back to the Constitution as written in the late 18th century, a conservative court was able to shoot down the legality and the viability of almost everything that people tried to do in order to protect themselves against the power and the influence of corporations who were claiming their right to freedom under the idea that sanctity and private property were natural rights, and that therefore no one had the right to interfere with their rights or their freedom to their property. And the assumption was that if government tried to regulate their business, regulate their property, then that was a violation of their individual freedom, the freedom of contract, the freedom that the employer had to enter into a contract with his employees and hold his employees accountable to the terms of that contract, which obviously was not, in many cases, we would not consider to be a just contract, because the power issue on either side of the equation was woefully unequal. In other words, the contractual power of the individual working person who was seeking a job and hoping to be able to keep it meant that they had almost no leverage at all against their employer. The employer had all the advantages and few of the disadvantages. And in many of the most prominent cases in the late 19th and early 20th century, corporations, employers were arguing that for government to try to interfere violated the sanctity of contract, and they would go back to John Marshall's decisions in the early 19th century, in which John Marshall celebrated and highlighted the sanctity of contract and the idea that nobody, government, nobody else had the right to violate the sanctity of contract. To do so was violating private property. And so consequently, the thinking of the time was that the only alternative left was to put pressure and demand that government do something in order to even the playing field, so level the playing field, so to speak. That meant that what citizens were asking government to do was totally 180 degrees different, the direct opposite of what the 18th century philosophy of government's legitimate governing authority was about. People were asking government to behave and act in ways that the founders did not believe government should do or that government should be able to do. That means then that the administrative state justified by Wilson is totally contradictory to the 18th century view of the legitimate role of government in a free society and a republican government. And I think the conservative criticism of the administrative state today, in the person of Clarence Thomas, George Will, and Charles Cooper, who are the three names that were associated with the conservative attack on the idea of the administrative state, and especially Charles Cooper's idea of going directly back to the people and asking the people to go along with an Article 5 convention which would make it possible to amend the Constitution in order to dismember the administrative state and render the administrative state impotent, is an effort to take the nation back to the original philosophy of the Constitution of the United States. It would be to deny the whole idea of a living Constitution and to suggest that the Constitution must be interpreted exactly the same way as it was interpreted when it was originally written. That's what Justice Scalia means by the idea of originalism, that the court's job in determining the constitutionality of legislation is to go back to the text, go back to the period, and basically do everything possible to discover and define the intent, the original intent of the Constitution in this particular area when it was originally drafted. Wilson's position, as articulated so well, I think, in his 1887 article, is that the Constitution of the United States could not survive, would not have survived 100 years had it not been able to adjust to changing circumstances. And what critics of the administrative state, Charles Cooper and George Will and the others are doing, Clarence Thomas, is going back to Madison, going back to Federalist number 51 and Federalist number 10, and quoting the paragraphs that justify the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances as originally built into the Constitution in 1787, 1788. All I would say is that there's evidence that even the founders themselves realized that the Constitution would have to be able to change and adjust itself to changing circumstances if it was going to remain relevant. And I call your attention back to the 1829 letter or journal entry of James Madison. And I mention that 1829, when Madison makes his case for abolishing property qualifications for voting, in order that the right to vote could be viewed as a kind of stake in society in order to help ensure the loyalty of citizens unable to own property. You'll recall that that particular piece of writing by Madison, very, very late in his life, Madison dies in 1836. So this is 7 years before he dies. But more important, it's 30 some odd years after the Constitution is written. And in this particular journal entry, which is available online, Madison projects the demographic future of the United States from 1829 for the next century up to what becomes the Great Depression in 1929, the crash of the stock market in 1929, and the beginning of the Great Depression. Madison projects the demographic future of the United States for the next century from 1829 on. And what he projects is the tremendous growth of American cities and American manufacturing, and the reality that more and more American citizens were going to be living in urban areas and were not going to be property owners in the traditional sense. Therefore, Madison believed that property qualifications for voting and office holding no longer were valid. That, in a sense, they worked early on when the Constitution was first drafted, but that in the face of a growing population which was comprised of more and more people who didn't own property, property qualifications for voting and office holding were not going to work. Property was no longer going to be a stake or a vested interest of enough people to matter. So Madison's argument was that for the stability and the security of the system itself, of the republic, an alternative had to be found to property qualifications in order to keep people committed and loyal to the society, to the system. And Madison saw the right to vote as possibly being able to fit that bill. And so he advocated in 1829 the demise of property qualifications for voting and office holding in order to make it possible for more and more states to expand the right to vote, in order, hopefully, that right to vote would give people a psychological connection, a sense of belonging, a feeling that they had a role to play in fashioning the laws under which they were asked to live. In other words, Madison was advocating a major constitutional change in the way this government operated. If you take Charles Cooper's argument against the administrative state seriously, if you take Justice Clarence Thomas' opinions in Supreme Court cases, recent Supreme Court cases, seriously, then you would have to conclude that Madison had ceased to be consistent with the philosophy of the founders. In other words, that would put you at odds with James Madison as James Madison was thinking in 1829. So I guess what I'm saying is, going back to the founders, in order to justify the criticism and the dismantling of the administrative state, is fine only so long as you cite sources from the late 18th century, but you ignore the changes that the founders themselves recognized that they would have to make in order to keep the Constitution viable. I think this is really the significance of what we're talking about. The difference between the so-called living Constitution and the idea of originalism, which would base the constitutionality of statute law on the original intent as it existed when the Constitution was first drafted. There's no question that if we insisted on that kind of original intent as the defining factor of constitutionality for legislation, our Constitution would cease to be flexible. It would cease to be viable. It would effectively become inoperative in the modern world. It seems to me that that's the issue here. And we could take time, and Cooper does this, and he does a fabulous job with it. I'm not negating the quality of Cooper's argument because it's quite solid. Cooper goes back and cites Supreme Court decisions through the years which effectively took the courts and Congress out of the determination of responsibility or accountability for federal agencies. In other words, more and more, the administrative state's reliance on the expertise of professionals caused both Congress and the courts over the years to back off and say that on particular issues, neither Congress nor the courts are qualified to make decisions on those issues that conflict with the points of view of the experts. And so the administrative state's reliance on expertise has meant that federal agencies over the years have been allowed to become judge and jury on their own power. They've been able to define their own power. The courts have been reluctant to do it. Congress has been reluctant to pass legislation to infringe on the power of federal agencies for fear that they would be stepping on the toes of experts whose wisdom was necessary, who knew better on that particular issue. So the result is, according to Justice Thomas, the result has been that many of these agencies are operating, are functioning as not only branches, executive, as agencies of the executive branch of government, but are also exercising legislative and judicial power as well. In other words, in too many cases, Justice Thomas argued, legislative, executive, and judicial powers which were separated in the Constitution have been allowed to come together in the same hands in many of these agencies. And Cooper cites James Madison in one of the Federalist Papers, I think number 49, who made the point that whenever legislative, executive, and judicial power all come under the hands of, fall into the hands of the same people, what we have is the definition of tyranny. And so therefore, the implication is that these federal agencies, which are exercising executive, legislative, and judicial powers at the same time, are effective examples of tyranny because they have effectively assumed absolute power. They have no accountability to anybody. They are rendered almost independently functioning operations. And they become so prominent and so important in today's world that they clearly do violate the separation of powers and checks and balances system built into the Constitution of the United States. And while we're talking federal system, of course, let's recognize that many state systems function on the same way: executive, legislative, and judicial power separated, with the idea of checks and balances system. And Wilson's argument is that you've got to build in accountability and openness so that the general public knows what's going on and can hold these agencies accountable. And Wilson's belief is if you do that, then you make it possible for them to exercise the kinds of power that they need to have in order to do their jobs. And so that's the issue. That's the challenge, if you will, is to give them enough power to do what they're created to do and do it well and efficiently and effectively, and at the same time render them accountable enough that they don't abuse their power and their influence. And so consequently, we've built this tremendous bureaucratic structure where different levels report to different levels. And the idea is that bureaucrats who make it into this system are supposed to operate within the system. You never go outside the rules. You never do end runs around your immediate supervisor. And the assumption is as long as that system of accountability is functioning, then there's an element of control over the abuse of power. And of course, we all know that there's a whole story associated with the idea of bureaucracy and the extent to which bureaucrats become so basically self-interested that the realities of bureaucracy tend not to work, tend to break down. There's a book, and I've been reading reviews of it. I don't have the book, but over the last several days I've been reading reviews of it. It's a book by an author, by actually a physicist, whose name was Schmidt, S-C-H-M-I-D-T. And basically it was on the idea of professionalism. And what his whole thesis is that basically professionalism and being accepted and recognized as a professional in your field inhibits rather than promotes creativity and innovation. That in order to make it through the bureaucratic hoops that are part of professionalism in our bureaucratic system, people are forced by the profession to behave according to the rules and demands of the profession in order that they are able to receive the support and the recognition as professionals by the profession. The result is, Schmidt argues, professionalism becomes counterproductive. Whereas bureaucracy appears to be the right way to go, in the fact it turns out to be the wrong way to go because it inhibits creativity, it inhibits thinking out of the box, and it basically insists on doing things the same way they were always done over and over again. In other words, it inhibits change, it inhibits creativity and flexibility and all the rest of it. So that's an idea of the kinds of literature that you can get into when you start talking about the pros and cons of bureaucracy. It seems to me this is the issue. These are the major points that I think our treatment of the administrative state and the attack against it, specifically the attack on Woodrow Wilson's defense of the administrative state, is all about. I think it fits very well into the mission here of the Virtual Center because of what it promises, what it proposes, what its implications are. I think the idea that these people who seek to dismantle the administrative state have chosen, and I'm thinking specifically of Cooper here, to look to the Article 5 convention as a way to do it, because they'll never get the legislature to do it, they'll never get the executive branch to do it, and they'll never get a Supreme Court comprised of 5 Clarence Thomases who look at Constitution from the original perspective that Clarence Thomas does. That Cooper's only meaningful or possible solution seems to be to go back to the people themselves and get them to do it. What does that say about the attitude towards the intelligence and the respect of the American people seems to be? I would argue that Cooper's reliance on an Article 5 convention is testimony, loud and clear, to the reality that they believe that their best chance at finding victory in this whole issue is their ability to manipulate the public, to stampede the public into an Article 5 convention by focusing on the administrative state's threat to the individual freedom of citizens. If you say that often enough and loudly enough, and if you put enough money behind it, they believe that eventually getting an Article 5 convention to convene is probably the best shot they have. Because the people that understand the issues, the judicial branch and the legislative branch, will never do it. Why won't they do it? Because they fully understand the pros and cons of the issue. The people won't. That seems to be the operative assumption of this whole argument. We can get the people to do things that we can't get other people to do because the other people understand too well what's going on. It seems to me that this whole campaign speaks to the presumptive ignorance that these people assume that they are confronting in the citizenry of the United States. All of it then comes back to the quality of education, the ability of our people to think and reason and understand, to do research and to read critically, to be able to perceive or to gain an idea of intent, to begin to see private agendas when the people who have them don't want them seen. All of these things seem to speak to a need for educational reform so that the general public will be able to see through these kinds of manipulative campaigns. They are well funded and they're extremely dangerous. It seems to me that that's really the basis of the unit or the material that we looked at in relation to the administrative state. I would love to hear from you on this because I really do believe it's important. I'm more than willing to go back and give it more time. If you raise issues and you see things that we haven't considered that ought to be considered, then I'm more than willing to go back and revisit the issue and go deeper and look for additional information and additional materials which elaborate on more and more of the specifics of this particular issue. But as far as we went, I hope that what we've been able to do for the last 55 minutes, the bulk of our first hour together today here at the Virtual Center, is to bring, or to wrap up, if you will, and bring to a conclusion this whole issue of the administrative state. Because I really believe that it's significant. What we are basically saying then is that from one perspective, Wilson's perspective, the administrative state is necessary in order for government to perform the duties that it needs to perform in the complex, modern, industrialized, information-driven, which is the 20th and 21st century, information-driven society. The other side is to go back, based on the idea of originalism, to the 18th century view of the Constitution and government as it was originally written. The idea being that the Constitution was written in a way not to allow government to function, but rather to make that ability to function or to govern difficult. I think that's the difference. And the reality is, and I think the ultimate conclusion is, the only way that our Constitution has been able to last for as long as it has is the fact that over the years it has found ways to adjust to changing circumstances and to new challenges. And if the conservatives who are attacking the idea of the administrative state are successful, then that ability to be flexible and to respond that has enabled the Constitution to make it this far will be lost. And the Constitution will be lost with it. I would suggest to you that the call for an Article 5 convention speaks to the goal or the intent of those who would dismantle the Constitution as it's currently operating in this country, which is the idea of the administrative state, and return to a period when government power to respond and to govern is replaced, I believe, by the power of wealth and behind-the-scenes influence over our state governments. I think that's what's happening. I think the big money that has gone into the securing of control of our state legislatures and our governors' mansions speak to the fact that there's a revolution going on in this country, an attempted revolution. And the Article 5 convention is increasingly surfacing as the mechanism that will make that revolution possible. I think as citizens we need to know it, we need to recognize it, we need to understand it, and we need to do everything we can do to defeat it. It's 58 minutes after the hour, and I think rather than get into something new, I think this is a good time to pause and take our break, a 5-minute break at the top of the hour, and we'll come back a few minutes after the top of the hour with our second hour here on today's Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Please stay with us. We'll break for 5 minutes, and we'll be right back. Thank you.
And civic responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to our second hour in this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Again, today is Wednesday, the 16th day of September in the year 2015. If you are just joining us, we welcome you to today's program, and we have just completed a topic, which is a review of our program on Monday, pretty much. And so we're about to begin a new topic in this second hour. So if you are just joining us, you will not have missed anything, because we'll be beginning the topic in question in a moment in this second hour. If you, however, have been with us for the full program together today, I would like to thank you for your willingness to stay with us and for your continued support of the Virtual Center and also of the Head On Radio Network. I think given the gist or the direction of some of the program and some of the issues that we've been addressing, I think it ought to be very clear, if indeed there's any question at all, as to why it is important that programming like that at the herd here on the Head On Radio Network is so important in today's world. I think the last issue we talked about is the attack on the administrative state and the call for an Article 5 convention to alter the Constitution in order to dismantle the administrative state is an example of exactly that point. I remind you that we do have a phone number. We would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. And finally, I do mention once again the fact that for the last couple of months, we've had a Facebook page. And there are a number of postings on the Facebook page which deal with some of the issues and some of the approaches to issues that we've dealt with here at the Virtual Center. So if you go to our Facebook page, if you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. And I would like you to know that I would love to hear from you on your reactions to some of the postings that are there. Please feel free to comment if there is an opportunity to comment directly on Facebook, on our Facebook page. I would love to get your comments there. If your comments come through the email or come by a call to our 304 phone number, then I welcome them, and I want you to know that you are indeed encouraged to make your thoughts and your thinking and your ideas known. There are two issues that I have on the table for our program today. Obviously, I didn't necessarily anticipate that our entire first hour would be spent on the administrative state, but I've been accused through the years of having diarrhea of the mouth, so it's kind of an inappropriate way to put it, but you know what I mean. I've been told, students have told me that it takes me 15 minutes to say hello, so and I apologize for that. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes to project the amount of time we're devoting to a particular issue, and I think back to the week that Bob Kincaid substituted for Mike Malloy earlier this month, or over Thanksgiving, as I recall, and how impressed I was with his ability to redirect his entire approach to the very rigid, restricted time frames that a program like that demands. And I guess, as somebody who tends to run on sometimes, my wife will tell me all the time, I would find it difficult to live within those kinds of restraints. And I admire Bob for his ability to be able to do that. With that, I'd like to get into a topic. One of the two topics. And I'm going to mention this one first because I'm scheduled to attend a meeting later this week on this particular subject. And depending on what happens at that meeting and what happens at subsequent meetings on the same issue, it might be that in a very short period of time, this topic will become a non-topic. At this point, it's still a viable topic. It's still a subject that is in the works, and at some point in time is going to make an effort to see the light of day. So therefore, I think it's appropriate to share this thinking with you. I'm not only doing this because I want you to know. More than anything else, I'm doing this because I really am soliciting your input or your ideas and your thinking on this. At this point, it's an idea. It's an idea that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about, And it's an idea that I feel that I could pretty well defend. But it's an idea I also recognize is so new that it really hasn't had the opportunity to withstand critical negative judgment. There could be flaws in the ointment here. There could indeed be things that I'm not considering or not thinking about. And my thinking is that if I share these ideas with you, our listening audience here at the Virtual Center, I might gain from it. I might gain insight and ideas and actually gain the benefit of your thinking on this particular issue, because I think it is a significant one. It is an issue which is extremely appropriate here in southern West Virginia, from where I'm speaking from at this point. But potentially, if this idea were to pan out, it seems to me it would be an idea that would have implications and possible benefits in other parts of the nation besides here. I think this is an idea that needs to have an opportunity to make it. And that's why I'm proposing it here. I've mentioned in previous programs and comments and issues related to education, both K through 12 education and higher education. And you know that in the last couple of weeks, we've done a couple of programs on higher education, specifically higher education in West Virginia, but obviously the issues associated with these programs go well beyond the area, the region that I happen to be in. These are issues that affect higher education generally, but I'm using the local circumstances and the local situations in order to make the case and to illustrate the realities of the point. In the course of our programming about higher education specifically, I've mentioned in recent weeks that here in southern West Virginia, West Virginia is undergoing major changes in higher education. And one of the realities of higher education in West Virginia is that the state of West Virginia has more public colleges per capita than any other state in the Union. If I'm not mistaken, and this is just it's a guess. I think it's an educated guess, but it's a guess. I believe that if you just look at 4-year institutions, regular bachelor's degree, 4-year public colleges and universities, I think there are 14 in West Virginia, in a state with a population of a little bit above 3 million people. That means that on a per capita basis, there are more public 4-year colleges in West Virginia per capita than anywhere else. Yet at the same time, West Virginia has the lowest college going rate in the Union. It's improving. I know our local press makes a point at the end of every semester as to whether enrollment at our public institutions has increased or declined. And there is a belief that the statistics, the data is suggesting that we're improving, that our high school graduation rates are improving. In fact, we're learning now that the State Board of Education is putting out data compiled over the 2013-2014 academic year, which suggests that our high school graduation rates are increasing materially, significantly. But the fact of the matter is, the people who graduate from high school in West Virginia and go on to college continues to decline. The value of a college education is not considered to be that viable here in West Virginia. Too many West Virginians don't see the benefits or the value to higher education. Higher education has always been here for the best students, for those students who come from families where where parents went to school, went to college. And the data, national data, suggests that if your parents went to college, you will. We never run into a situation where people who go to and graduate from college bring children into the world that don't. Although we are witnessing a period right now where well-educated, quite literate people are making the case that we may have peaked in terms of the viability of higher education, not only in West Virginia, but throughout the nation. Many people are beginning to suggest that our society and its dependence on technology is reaching the point where the traditional 4-year bachelor's degree is becoming less and less a need and more a luxury. And the idea is that if you have the particular skill set that gives you the opportunity to succeed in today's technological world, then increasingly it's becoming less and less a necessity to secure the 4-year degree. I know that in my own family, for example, I have a nephew. Excuse me, not a nephew, a grandnephew, who is extremely technologically gifted, who went to a technical high school and just graduated this past summer and was immediately hired by a tech company for his technology skills. And after a few months was lured away by the local school system and has been hired within the past 6 months as the IT, the internet technologist, if you will, the IT expert for the entire school system, and it's a fairly significant school system. He's got a good job with a good income, and his future is secure because his technology skills are so profound. So the question is, will he take time or put forth the effort to pursue successfully a college degree? Many people are telling him that in his case, he doesn't need it. He's already where a college degree would take him. So therefore, it would be fluff. It would be unnecessary for him. When asked, I've tried to counter that by pointing out some of the other benefits and advantages of a college education besides the nature of the job that you'll likely get. And one of the issues I pointed out, for example, is that the circles, the social circles and economic circles within which he's going to be functioning in future years are going to demand that he broaden his education and be able to function and communicate in circles that at this point he might find it very, very difficult to operate in. There's absolutely no question in our society that the level of your education and the depth of your education determines to a certain degree your ability to function and manipulate and maneuver in particular circles, in particular social and economic circles. So to deny yourself the benefit of a college education is to relegate yourself to social contacts and social interactions in a very limited portion of today's society. And I don't think anybody wants to do that. But that's an aside. That's an issue that I don't think is relevant to this. The fact of the matter is, we have a unique situation here in southern West Virginia, and that we have colleges where the opportunity for attendance at a 4-year college is quite available. Access is really not the problem. But the willingness to go and the recognition of the need for and respect for the value of a college education leaves quite a bit to be desired in this region. Part of it is because of the state's history, its dependence on coal, the fact that the entire economy of the state, since its very existence when it came into being in 1863 during the Civil War, when it broke away from the state of Virginia, it has always been an extractive state. And what I mean is it has contained significant and valuable elements of natural wealth. Coal, timber, natural gas, for example. And so the value of investment in West Virginia has been investment in these extractive industries. And that has meant that there have been very, very lucrative, well-paying jobs in coal over the years, and in timber, and now in natural gas extraction. And so consequently, those who are born to go to college, who from the very beginning there's never a question about whether they're going to college, the so-called the best and the brightest, have traditionally secured a college education in West Virginia and then gone elsewhere for career opportunities. In other words, for the most part, colleges and universities in West Virginia have been a ticket out of the region for our best and our brightest. So consequently, over the years, the brightest of our young people have tended to leave the state. And those people for whom traditional 4-year college education has not been something that they have valued have looked toward the mines and very good incomes in the mines in order to secure a well-paying, very comfortable living. But given what's happening to coal, given what's happening in West Virginia to the economy, those alternatives are rapidly disappearing. And the result is that our colleges are finding it more and more difficult to enroll qualified students in a state with a regularly shrinking population. The size of our graduating classes in high school declines year after year after year. In other words, the availability of qualified college students is becoming more and more competitive amongst an overwhelming number of institutions competing for these students. And of course, in addition to the public institutions, we have a number of private institutions here as well. So, I mean, if you wanted to use the word, West Virginia is awash in colleges and universities, and now community colleges. We have a number of community colleges in West Virginia as well. But the fact of the matter is, the one thing that all of these institutions have in common, whether it be the major universities, West Virginia University and Marshall University, whether it be the the small and mid-size previous colleges that have become universities in recent years, or whether it's the community colleges that offer a number of associate and certificate programs in various kinds of things: air conditioning, electrician, auto mechanics, etc., etc., etc. The one thing that all these institutions have in common is that they seek to enroll qualified students. And the number of qualified students is declining. But the fact of the matter is, there remains in this region a significant number of people, citizens, who are not being served by our colleges and universities because they don't currently meet muster. Maybe they didn't graduate from high school. Maybe if they did graduate from high school, they never intended to go to college. Maybe they didn't take the right classes in high school which meet the admission requirements for many of our colleges. But even our community colleges, which are so-called open enrollment, that don't have admission standards, even they operate on the assumption that they require a high school diploma or what is traditionally referred to as a GED to go there. In other words, even our community colleges don't offer degree programs to those who don't meet minimum qualifications. And the fact of the matter is there are a significant number of people in this region who remain unserved by our current higher education establishment. And here in the area that I'm in, which is southern West Virginia, we now have West Virginia University moving into the picture in the southern part of the state. For those of you who aren't familiar with West Virginia, the state university, West Virginia University, is located in the very northern part of West Virginia. The southern part of West Virginia is 3.5 to 4 hour drive on interstate from the very southern part of the state to the northern part of the state in order to get to the main campus of West Virginia University. So many people locally are all excited about the fact that West Virginia University is coming to Beckley, is coming to southern West Virginia, and is taking over the vacant campus that used to be owned by Mountain State University, which lost its accreditation a few years ago and was forced to close its doors. They have a campus here. And so West Virginia has been able to move in, and for what I think is a relatively generous price of $8 million, buy a campus that consists of a number of very high, modern, high-tech facilities. I think $8 million is a pretty good deal for West Virginia. But the assumption is that the existence of West Virginia University in this part of the state is going to play a big role in revitalizing the economy of the state, turning the economy around, so to speak. And so what's going on right now is that there are a number of meetings being held between the existing four-year colleges that are already in the southern part of the state with West Virginia University in trying to make determinations as to which programs would be the optimum ones for West Virginia University to bring to the region. In other words, the question is, will these institutions end up competing with each other for the same students? Or will they be allowed to offer complementary curriculum which make it possible for these institutions to not duplicate their services and compete with each other for the same students? That doesn't seem to be financially viable or institutionally wise either. So the meetings are happening now. But the point I make is that while these meetings are happening, the fact is that there's a whole element of the population in this region that remains outside the higher education world that is becoming more and more available in this part of the state. And there are many people, I don't know how many, but I happen to be one, who believe that I don't care how many colleges and universities come into the region, until somebody is willing to address the unmet needs of an underemployed or underemployed, undereducated population of adults in this region, then the region's economy is going to be very difficult to turn around. West Virginia has reached the point as a state where more than 50% of its working age adult population are unemployed, don't work, and many of whom are drawing a check, whether it be a disability check, a welfare check, or whatever. If the economy is going to turn around, somebody is going to have to find a way to turn that population around. Find a way to make non-productive, non-contributing citizens productive and contributing. And that means they're going to have to be able to provide an incentive. Because up to this point in time, many of the people who are drawing a check have been reluctant to make a change for fear that they would lose what little they have. If they're poor enough, they're on Medicaid. Plus the fact that West Virginia, I should add, is one of the older states in the Union. We have an older population than most other states. That means that a significant portion of our population is on Medicare. So if you combine Medicare and Medicaid, you can begin to see where this idea of something in excess of 50% of the working age population is drawing a check. When you add senior citizens to that who are on Medicare, the number is incredible. So the issue is, with this size population proportionally not contributing to the economic growth and viability of the region, how do you turn the economy around? We've got to find a way to move people who have pretty well adjusted to the fact that they'll never have to be required to move again. Many of them are non-productive and work hard to remain non-productive. Because while they don't have much, they can't afford to risk what little they do have in change. So they're reluctant to move into new opportunities, because traditionally moving into new opportunities has happened with a cost. Maybe, for example, if one went back to school to pursue a college degree or even a certificate or a 2-year degree or something like that, then you would lose your Medicaid. Your kids would lose their CHIP coverage, the Children's Health Insurance Program. So if your kids have health insurance and they have it because you're too poor and you qualify for Medicare, then there's a disincentive there to do anything about it. Yet if we don't do something about it, we're going to have an inordinate number of our population dependent on working people in the area, and that is not conducive to economic growth. Rather, it's conducive to a continuation of population loss. People will continue to leave in pursuit of greener pastures because they get uncomfortable here working for low wages in most of the jobs that are available, which tend to be service sector jobs. Most of the better paying jobs in the region are either in the schools or in the healthcare fields. But they don't pay a whole lot. Social work is a big profession in this part of the region because there are so many people in need of social worker services. But the fact of the matter is, people who work hard for little money continue to, increasingly resent the fact that there's a whole portion of the population that doesn't work at all and yet makes it. And not only do they make it, but they don't seem to have any incentive to change things. So therefore, their existence on the receiving end of services is not temporary. Many people in this region see it as permanent. I know our local Southern West Virginia United Way continues to increase its goal every year to an incredible level for a region with this much poverty in it. There are so many people in this region in need for food, clothing, children's shoes, the basics. How do you turn an economy around that's in this kind of shape? All of this is introduction to the point that I want to make. I believe that it is possible to create an educational opportunity, to put together the kind of educational opportunity that will make it possible for people to move in whatever direction they choose to move in. I believe that it's possible to introduce a level of education in this region that would literally grow the college-going population. The fact that we have a significant number of people in this region who are not currently qualified to attend colleges and universities, I believe it's possible to make available to them a level of education that would qualify them should they choose to go to college. It would also qualify them should they choose to go into the world of work, should they choose to focus in the direction of a career. One of the things that I've become convinced of over the more than half century that I've been in higher education is that there are certain elements, certain basics that give people not only the knowledge, but the skills that they need to move on, to make them self-functioning, independently functioning adults. What I'm thinking about is the idea of creating some sort of an academy whose purpose would be to educate people for whom their educational experience up to this point in time has not been successful. Whether it be high school dropouts, whether it be underperforming high school graduates, whether it be unemployed or underemployed adults who see a very, very limited future for themselves. I believe that what we need is an academy or an institution of some kind that will take advantage of the existing situation and focus attention and services on that element of the population that has the ability to turn the economy of this region around. And I'm fortunate enough to know people who agree with me. Right now we're in a situation, as I mentioned, I have a meeting Friday morning with a good friend and former colleague. There are 3 of us who are heavily involved in this effort. 2 of the 3 are retired. 1 could be. The irony is the oldest of the 3 of us is still working. What we're talking about here is something in the neighborhood in 3 people of 160 to 170 years of experience in higher education and in corporate America. One of the three of us spent 40 years in the private sector working for Westinghouse. And he was in the recruitment and training end of Westinghouse. He trained employees. He knows the private sector needs. He knows the world of work. He knows what education needs to do in order to turn out people that employers need and want. He knows why colleges and universities seem unable to meet that need. The other two of us have spent our entire careers in higher education. I'm in excess of 50 years, and my good friend and colleague is close to it. He just retired this past year. What we're considering is an academy. We could call, I don't care what we call it. I can't come up with a catchy name. But for lack of a better purpose and to make the point, let's call it a success academy, whose purpose will be to introduce to this particular population a level and style and degree of education that they have never experienced before. We are driven by the belief that learning is exciting and that people will become caught up in it. It's infectious for those who experience it, recognizing that many never do. Our goal is to teach people how to teach themselves, is to provide people the kind of experience, the kind of learning experience that will create the real potential for lifelong learning, to turn out people who have experienced the excitement of learning, of creating new knowledge, and of mastering that knowledge, and the skills necessary to move on and create new knowledge in new situations with new challenges that we can't even anticipate at this point in time. The question that has plagued higher education for generations: how do you prepare people for industries and employment areas which don't even exist yet? By the time you create a curriculum and set up a program to turn out people who are proficient in that particular discipline or that particular area, technology and the economy has moved on, and the opportunities that were available are no longer there. So increasingly, we're turning out people to fulfill jobs that no longer even exist. The answer to that is to somehow prepare people for industries and workplace experiences that currently don't even exist yet. They haven't even been invented. How do you do that? By going back to the very core of education. And I mentioned core very, very advisedly because I'm fully aware of the idea of the Common Core. I think the thing that has probably endeared me more than anything to the idea of the Common Core is the basic belief or the basic recognition that there is a core of learning that makes additional learning, new learning, possible. Not only possible, but likely. It's based on the idea that there are certain things that people need to know before they learn other things. And we, for whatever reason, have never been able to focus or zero in on those particular things. We're going to do it. That's the idea. That's the proposal. My thinking is that here in southern West Virginia, with a declining college-ready population of eligible students, we can literally prepare our own students. We can literally create our own college-going population by addressing those who currently aren't qualified and teaching them in ways that will make them qualified. Accountability. It is my belief that a student who experiences this process, who is willing to go through this experience, will be able to pass any admissions test, any requirement, SAT, ACT, pre-SAT, I don't care what it is. Colleges can give these folks any tests they want, and they will demonstrate that they are college ready. They are so qualified and so able to teach themselves that if they choose to, they can go right into the pursuit of career opportunities. We're operating on the assumption that we can't teach people what they need to know in order to perform on the job when we don't even know yet what the job is. What we have to do instead is turn out people who are able to learn what they need to know in order to be able to do the job once the job becomes available. These people will be so adept that they will not only be doing jobs working for other people, these will be people that will create jobs for themselves. They will be traditional products of higher education. They will be people who create jobs, not just the people who work for other people. They will not be bound and limited by their skills. Rather, they will be rendered unlimited and flexible because of the skills that they do have. That's the idea. That's what's driving us. 2 of us are on board. The 3rd will be introduced to this particular proposal on Friday. And we'll see where it goes from there. Basically, what we're saying is none of the existing colleges and universities can meet the needs of this region. We've got to meet it for ourselves. And I believe that as old as we are in years, we have not only the motivation and the desire, but the skills to give this a viable shot. And we have decided that before we leave this world, we'd like to be able to leave it with something that benefits from the fact that we were here. That's the idea. That's the proposal. That's the plan. Much of it has been evolving over the months here at the Virtual Center. If you get into the specifics as to how this will work, there are a lot of details associated with it that I won't bore you with right now, because that deals with more or less the implementation, the design of curriculum, and all the rest of it. The one thing I do know is that we're going to need to be able to employ technology in education as technology has never been employed before. We are going to have to move beyond the need for the student to come to the educational classroom. We're going to have to use technology in ways that make it possible to bring the classroom to the student, but at the same time do it in ways which are totally different than the current online classes that we have available, where students never complete them, The only way you can get students to complete them is to so lower the benchmark, so lower the bars in terms of performance and assessment that the experience becomes academically meaningless. We're not talking about making available meaningless academic experiences. We are talking about turning out or making available the most rigorous, most demanding educational experiences that most of these people have ever encountered. We are talking about a curriculum that is going to be so rigorous, and so demanding that literally it will embarrass many of our colleges and universities, because the quality of what our people are learning is going to be so much superior to the quality of what many people are currently learning in colleges and universities that they attend. It's idealistic. It's pie in the sky. It's something that we're going to have to reach for. It's something that everybody who participates in it is going to have to reach for something. We are not going to adjust learning to the levels of incoming students. Every student is going to learn that every experience, every encounter in this entire process forces every student to reach a level of achievement that they hadn't reached before. The minute people have to stop stretching themselves, they stop learning. We can't afford to have any of that in this system. That's the plan, and I'm going to be meeting, as I mentioned on Friday, myself and one of my colleagues are going to be meeting with the third one, who we kind of suspect is with us on this, because much of the evolution of this whole process has been done over the months with his involvement. So we think we're going to have a triumvirate of three of us to begin this process. We're obviously going to need people with expertise in the areas of science and mathematics. We're going to involve or introduce some of the latest scientific research on learning, on the operations and functions of the human brain, on the way people learn, on the way people develop skills. We're not going to be interested in knowledge that is buried deep in the back reaches of people's brains. We need to be able to generate the kinds of knowledge and skills that will remain in the forefront of what people do, what they encounter, what challenges they face, etc. Let me read you. This is a program which one of our next programs here at the Virtual Center will focus on this idea in more detail. But one of the people who has written extensively on educational reform, especially K through 12 educational reform in America, and who's all over the Common Core, is a Washington Post education writer named Jay Matthews. He's been a columnist at the Washington Post for 40 years. And he mentions the fact, he acknowledges that he has concerns about the Common Core, but he also has significant affinity for the Common Core. There are things about it he likes. When asked to take a firm stand on the Common Core, Jay Matthews says that he always responds with what the Chinese used to call the Win faction. The idea that sometimes I blow this way and sometimes I blow that way. There are some things about it I like, and there are some things about it that worry me. Jay Matthews points out that what he calls the best argument in favor of the Common Core that he has ever heard comes from Robert Pondiscio, a teacher who writes for the Fordham Institute. He has taken 2 sentences from key Common Core document, and he has termed these 2 sentences the 57 most important words in educational reform ever, unquote. Here are those words. By reading texts in history and social studies, science, and other disciplines, students build a foundation of knowledge in these fields that will also give them the background to be better readers in all content areas. Students can only gain this foundation when the curriculum is intentionally and coherently structured to develop rich content knowledge within and across grades, unquote. This is a defense of the Common Core. It doesn't counteract all the criticisms of the Common Core, and we'll get into that in our next program. There are major criticisms of it. We know that. But it says something about the intent of the Common Core, which has long been the reason that I've been an advocate of it. What I've introduced here in this hour is an implementation of that philosophy outside the limitations or the structure of our K through 12 system. I'm talking about the creation of an institution that is driven directly by that philosophy. That there are certain content areas, certain knowledge, that once people master them, they become the foundation which makes it possible for people to learn other things in other areas. And if you don't focus on the delivery of those particular content areas, then you inhibit rather than make possible self-learning. Our goal is to isolate those content areas and develop the entire academy experience around them. That's what we're after. That's what I'm proposing. And the next step, of course, will be finding a way to do it. Since we are all retired folks, we don't need $1 million in salary or grant money to make this work. All we need is opportunity and support. Minimal support, minimal financial support. We need access to the internet. We need access to classroom space. We need the basics that would be necessary to deliver a program like this in a fairly large, diverse geographical area. Our needs are minimum. We anticipate the idea that our success will not generate money for ourselves, but rather will generate income that we can plow back into the enterprise in order to experience it and make it better for other people. So in that sense, we are a nonprofit. We are a nonprofit private institution. Private institutions, by definition, are profit, unless they seek government support. If they get government support, they subject themselves to government control and government regulations. That would inhibit everything we're trying to do. So we know what we need. We're going to go about doing it. It's 3 o'clock. We've finished our time together. Thank you so much. This is Bill O'Brien. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you on Monday here at the Virtual Center. Thank you.